summits. Today I'm going to cover something slightly different. And it is very much like was just being said. Ultimately, actually, for most of my career, I've focused on customer delivery, success and quality. And Fast Track and Microsoft play a huge part of that. And I've worked historically on the customer side, on the partner side, and within Microsoft. So I've got a view of all angles of it. And I really wanted to, suppose, give you guys a lot of the information that I have managed to discover through all of those different roles, and especially from my time within Microsoft working directly with the Fast Track team on behalf of our partners. So really just about me. I am an absolute nerd, complete and utter nerd, not ashamed of it either. If you ever want to see what's going on and what I'm up to, because I'm doing a lot in the community at the moment and tend to try and share things that might be useful, and people tend to say it's a little bit useful, so that's a good show. I'm on Twitter and I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me, reach out to me. Anything I cover today, absolutely just ask, because I'm happy to support and help. To break down the topic of ultimately the delivery and Fast Track and how Microsoft supports, I'm going to be covering the history of actually why do we have Fast Track? Why does it exist? And then I've got the Microsoft customer support structure, because there's more to that than just Fast Track, and some people might not necessarily be aware. Then we'll talk a little bit more about how do we make sure that we make the most of all of these opportunities that we have to get the finance and operations delivery successful, because we've all been there. We've been in them problem projects where everything gets a bit political and crazy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we will go into a Q&A, and I'll try and leave enough time for you guys. But if not, like I said, reach out to me. Before I dive in, I did want to reach out to you all for a bit of help. So we are, Mizelle, Julia and I, reinstigating what used to be the AXUG for London and the United Kingdom, because we noticed the last couple of years it went a bit quiet and dry. But before we do that, we are doing a bit of a questionnaire out to the community to say what sort of format would you like it to be. So I've got the AKA MS link here. Please, if it takes 2 seconds, reach out, because we really want to make a community and more amazing events like this available to everyone and information to everyone to reinvigorate that community and reinvigorate that forum for all of us really across the world eventually, because those forums are brilliant, and I think especially in the UK we've lost it a little bit, so just trying to bring it back to something that's amazing and as strong as the ones are in the US. But yeah, let's jump in. So where did it start? What even is Fast Track? Where did it come from? Back in those days where we all used to cry, we were implementing AX 2012, 2009. We usually had an infrastructure provider that did that for us on the actual physical machines. We usually had to do some really beefy, chunky customizations because the functionality wasn't quite there yet. And Microsoft gave out a sure-step methodology for us to use. And most of the people that I think were honest with themselves, the sure-step functionality never really fitted. Yeah, it was a bit of a baseline, but most partners then brought out their own methodology that had a little bit more context, a little bit more alignment to how they wanted to implement ERP, and had a bit more to it. And then SureStep started to disappear. And that was around the time when we were moving to what was AX7, or the cloud version. And there was a reason for that. When Microsoft decided and made the decision that they were going to move their ERP solutions into the cloud, what they were actually taking on was further responsibility for the stability of the application. So when you take on that infrastructure, well, suddenly you do have to care a bit about performance. You have to care a bit about whether they get live. You have to care about what size the customer is, how many transactions they're going to be taking on. So suddenly this cloud-hosted software has taken on a new world of its own, and the security and the structure and stability of it, Microsoft needed a way to check that all of that was going to be okay when their customers got live, because suddenly that responsibility moved from an infrastructure provider onto them, and they'd never really had that before. So the first thing that came out was the go live checklist. And this was when, to be honest, even still when we were on AX7, if you were really lucky, you could still jump onto the production box because everyone was still trying to work out what was going on. And then it sort of came to the realization that wasn't enough, because customers would try and go live when actually they still weren't quite ready. They still weren't quite them ultimately to be for that project, to make sure it was successful and make sure they had all of the information they needed to ensure the customer would go live and be happy with what they've purchased and what they've proceeded. So that's literally where Fast Track came from, because it's a way for Microsoft to provide free additional support to ultimately protect the customers and protect themselves from what that's going to look like when they get in production. And that really is the first message of, okay, so now where do we go with this? And where do we go with this conversation? Because we really need to, especially with people who have worked with, whether you're a customer or a partner, and you have a Fast Track assigned architect, it's so common to see that people aren't actually taking advantage of that relationship, and they are there to ultimately make sure everyone's happy in the success of the project. When it comes to projects, especially ERP transformations, they're so embedded in wider IT transformation that actually a 7 out of 10 failure rate is really high. And this isn't Microsoft. This is if you look at the SAPs, if you look at the Oracles, it's because the definition of failure is based on, did you do it within budget? Did you do it within the timeline that you originally agreed? Did it meet the business objectives? Well, a lot of customers get live, but oh, it was over budget or it was a bit delayed. And there may be a general justification for that, because suddenly after interrogating the business processes more or interrogating the art of the possible more, they wanted more functionality or needed more functionality. But that's where this definition comes from. And this is where Microsoft started to think, well, this usually goes wrong because of the solution strategy, the business processes, and the change management. So it's not actually necessarily the software. We all know the software has gaps. All software has gaps because they're trying to be generic and agnostic to different industries to ultimately have the market presence that applications like finance and operations do. But a lot can be pulled down to things that are not directly related to the software. So when it comes to business applications, you have to think about the wider transformation, and the customers and the partners and Microsoft have to have that understanding of the wider transformation. What's going to make sure that's successful? You got things on this list like executive sponsorship. How often have we all seen that actually the executive sponsorship with best intentions, if they're not visible, if they're not active, if they're not aware of the information they need to make fast strategic decisions, that causes some issues. You know, adoption and value, getting the users to buy into the systems, want to train on it, want to get access to it, want to understand how to transition from their legacy systems to new systems with new processes. You know, let's not just buy a new system and migrate off a legacy system, but try and recreate identical processes in the new system, because that's a comfort zone. How do you get that buy-in from these customers who are have the expertise everyone needs of their own needs and requirements, and get them into the new application in a way that's ultimately aligns to the application and gives them additional business value away from that legacy? So thinking of all of that, thinking of how often these go wrong just because of non-software elements, and ultimately the project structure, Fast Track suddenly needed to become more, because it was no longer just about software. So Microsoft then went away and they thought, how do we do this? And there was two big programs that came out of it. You had the Fast Track program and you had the Customer Success program. Most of you will know about the Fast Track program, but the Customer Success program maybe not so much. Under the Customer Success program and the Customer Success unit, They are only really getting involved in, at any point in time, the top 100 to 150 customers within the United Kingdom at any point in time. So every country will have a quota, and they will be the highest revenue, high or strategic or complexity based on industry customers that will get a customer success manager to support them. That is up for conversation, whether you become one of those customers or not, or whether your customer becomes one of those or not. And it's a conversation to have, but it's much less common to see them on a program. Whereas Fast Track, they're always there, but they have different levels of availability for you depending on who the customer is directly. And what they're trying to do when they're giving you access to these programs is to go back and make sure all of those issues we've just talked about don't actually exist anymore. They want to provide guidance, readiness, enablement. They actually talk about change management, making sure you're doing your change management and adoption properly, and trying to make sure that you can get it deployed in a realistic but also efficient manner. They want you to use your licenses, they want you to get into the live system, they want you to love it and to use it and to make the most of your investment. So how does that all break down? Because now we've got, especially in the programs that do get the customer success unit and the fast track team, suddenly we've got a lot of different people, because from a customer perspective, you just hired a partner to sort this out. And from a partner perspective, it's, well, we're supposed to be doing this, so Microsoft, go away. And it's trying to find out, well, where is the roles and responsibilities? Where does it lie? And the honest answer is, as someone who, even in the last year, was involved in 3 different programs that had all of the above, how the customer and partner have ultimately contracted and feel comfortable having the relationship. Because the more access and ability you want to engage in these teams within Microsoft, the more that you will use them. And if sometimes there is a customer who is very comfortable and very competent in what they're doing, and a partner that's very assured of what they're doing, they will use it less. But the natural fit does have to evolve based on the needs of the partner and the customer, not necessarily anyone being a bit scared to want to be open, because the access you can have is huge. So you can have your technical focus on your technical teams, your fast track really providing that guidance, the onboarding for the customer, that technical support. Then you can have your customer success manager that comes in. They can do ProSci evaluations to double check and see, oh, actually, where do they see any possible weaknesses in what's going on? Maybe it could be the change management. Maybe it could be that the sponsor needs to change the way they're engaging with the teams, or is there enough delegated responsibility, or does it need to change? Is the structure of change control properly? All of that can then be pulled back in and provided for free to support programs of work. If you're on a project that doesn't have the customer success manager involved, it has been known also for the fast track team to support ultimately the project structure and change management as well. So the fast track team are incredibly diverse in the skill sets and also the access they have in Microsoft, which we'll hear about later. But none of this supersedes what the implementation partner is trying to achieve. And all this is ever intended to be is additional support and access to both the customer and partner into the world of Microsoft. So they are a conduit for you to say, well, actually, we want this process, or we've got this gap. Is there anything coming that might be able to fix this? Or this doesn't really seem to work, or we've got a blocker in the program, but there's 10 different opinions of how we might fix it. Do you have some advice? And that's ultimately the structure, the drive, that this is the baseline that's always provided. But it's really, really important to try and figure out how you're going to structure this team and what that's going to lay out, is going to look like for your program and your program of work based on the comfort level, which then can evolve. You would expect and require Microsoft to be more involved, especially fast track, towards your go live. And that's really important. The early stages of your design to help you make sure if you have a gap, well, they could talk to the product group and say, oh, we've got this new functionality coming, and this is great. And then in the build, everyone disappears. If you find, software bugs, fast track and support or escalate. And then in the go live, they obviously will support the go live process because they'll be much heavier and more engaged again at that point. When we talk about, okay, this is fast track, this is a customer success unit, we talk about who gets access to what. This is what's most fundamentally changed this year. And from January 2021, the realization happened that Microsoft needed to be able to support more customers more efficiently. And what that means is rather than a two-tier approach, which usually used to be, I believe it is a 100K revenue historically, whereas if a partner had above that, they would be classed as a customer that would get the additional access. And if a customer license revenue was lower than that, then they would have basic access. Well, they've turned it into a three-tier approach now. For anyone who is interested, I did put in here all of the applications that you can get fast track support on. It's not just finance and operations. There are most of the Dynamics 365 suite, you can get this. As of this year, any customers need to be nominated. You cannot expect any access if you don't nominate the customer. Microsoft's not now tracking that. They are tracking it, but the expectation is that the customer or the partner or a Microsoft employee nominates that customer for access to the fast track team. There's also new caveats, and this is quite interesting, especially for the partners that are out here and the customers who want to go to maybe smaller partners. You have to now have someone allocated to your project who is a partner, who is registered as a partner to Microsoft. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be an official partner company. I know of many people who are 1, 2, 3 teams of companies who are registered as a partner. It's not complicated, but it's a way for Microsoft to ultimately make sure that the customers are tracking and using the support of a partner with access into the wider organization. So that's an interesting change that hasn't been there before. Also, that partner, especially for the larger customers, and there is some flexibility from what I have seen and been made aware of in the smaller customers, they should have gold or silver status in the competency for that application. So if you are implementing customer service, field service, for example, they should have the competency for a customer engagement solution, and finance, supply chain, e-commerce, they should have it operations. If you don't have that, Microsoft within their remit to just not allow access to fast track, because they're trying to encourage all customers to make sure they're going with a partner that has ultimately been qualified by Microsoft beforehand, just to make sure that the partner has the experience and the knowledge that they should have to make sure that you're going to be successful. If they don't have that, well, you can still have access. You'll still have the go live assessment. You need that. That needs to happen no matter what. You still got the tech talks that you have access to, and you have on-demand training that you can do for MS Learn, which I know someone was mentioning earlier, which is a brilliant site and I use quite a lot. But for partners on the call, it's really interesting because you now have a responsibility to make sure all of your partner team are getting access to the on-demand training and registering for the Success by Design training. If you don't have team members going through this training, the fast track team will refuse to support and they will push you to do that. So it's not exhaustive, it's not too much. Just take it and have a look. And they are tracking this internally as to who has taken it and who hasn't. So if you have customers that are coming in, strategic customers that you want to get this fast track support, you also need to make sure as a partner that your partner team are trained. So what does that really look like when we talk about fast track and what support they're providing? They want to understand your vision and your business value of what you're trying to achieve. because it's all about actually, can you then quantify that customer as successful? Are they meeting the objective of why they even started looking for a new system in the first place? How are they going to do it? Well, have they done all the right checks and balances? Have you found all your interfaces? Have you found all of your security principles that you need to align to? Have you talked about your data migration? You need an action plan. How are you going to optimize it to make sure that you're getting the best benefits from the system, from the automation of the system as you can? And what are your benchmarks then for making sure that you class that as successful? What's that, where is your longer process and progress that you're going to do? Because it's not just about putting the ERP in, it's about then making sure that in 5 years' time, you don't want to move systems again. You still have a roadmap going forward. So what then is Fast Track going to do? The first thing that ultimately they do support in, which is quite critical, is the onboarding assistance that's through lifecycle services. When you're a customer, you're buying your licenses, you're thinking, okay, what happens now? There's an activation period, and through lifecycle services, it supports you getting that up and running, getting your first environments, for example. This is massively dependent on the partners as well. So this is where this relationship building between the 3 different teams starts to become really critical, and that needs to be invested in by all parties. The customer should always have someone internally who takes ownership for these sort of things, because there are items in this approach in delivering finance and operations that you can't just expect the partner to do. It's not something that you can buy the licenses, give your requirements, and walk away and say, I'll come back in 6 months and I want it done. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, and it does require technical level responsibility from the customer team to manage the customer's tenant and organizational structure, which this becomes part of. Then it's talking about ultimately everything we expect. So I'm going to go into the more detail about what Fast Track means, because it's everything. This is all of your access to all of Microsoft everywhere, and not just on general conversations. Your solution architecture design and your enterprise architecture design. How does your finance and operations impact your Office 365 or Microsoft 365 implementations? You can then talk to them and go through them to get some advice from MCS or the customer success managers or support. You're going to have ultimately, whether that's through your partner, indirectly or directly to Microsoft support services. Fast Track is the central point when you are in a program to all of these different units throughout the life cycle of your program of work, ultimately up until really your hypercare finishes. After that point, then they'll walk away because they'll be happy in the awareness that you're up and running and you don't really need them anymore. And that's why your Fast Track architect becomes so important and so vital to what you're doing. So I suppose, and this is where from my experience, I find it goes so commonly wrong. And this is a difficult one. And this is where that conflict of interest sometimes comes in, the politics sometimes comes in, because what should it look like? If you have more than one cook in a kitchen, can they decide how they want to cook a really good soup? And it can be like that. Your customer team, always at the end of it, should have some of their skills that they've hired in to provide guidance and business change support about ultimately what that solution needs to look like, what those core requirements really are. When it comes from an RFP stage, because they're solution agnostic, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's all of the information or the right structure to know now, once you've chose a system, what your requirements are anymore, because those requirements could change based on which application you're choosing to implement. Your Fast Track architect will be around, and depending on ultimately the customer, so after they've been nominated, you'll be evaluated on how many licenses that you're procuring, the industry you're coming from, if it's strategic or not, where that customer is ultimately in their entire relationship with Microsoft, not even just finance and operations. And depending on that, they'll have more or less time available to you. So some customers will find that they won't have a designated fast track architect, but they'll have access to the fast track tools, and just for the go live checklist, they'll go through the team. Others will find that it's bi-weekly, there will be a meeting that you'll get to catch up with the fast track architect, and it will be a light touch where the partner will still take much more of the solution blueprint design on board, which is why the training is now becoming mandatory. And they will be expected to do that. Or if you are quite a significant customer in their view, or you've been given that level, the fast track architect is much more heavily involved, even to the point of joining in some workshops and some solution guidance. So that relationship becomes quite important. And the partner team do as everything you would always expect them to do. They are still ultimately responsible for the design of the solution. It's not Microsoft that are responsible for doing that. They're just responsible for doing some oversight and guidance. The partner team have to work with the customer team to interrogate and build out the requirements baseline, the delivery backlog, and do the first hit of, okay, what should that solution structure look like? What should that design look like? The fast track architect should only start coming in more if you do, I think, like I said earlier, have a particular blockage that you think, well, we haven't seen something about this. Have you got anything that's coming? I had an example about a month or so ago. The customer had a really complex tax structure. Well, the fast track architect turned around and said, well, okay, you've got this real complex tax structure. You're looking to do a really big customization. Actually, there's a tax API that's being developed, which means that you can actually integrate to a specific tax system, which meets your requirements, to take that out of the application and then push all the information you need back in. Straight away, even though that wasn't at the time something that was publicly disclosed, it was now something that could completely change the perspective of the customer and the partner of what they was going to design, because neither party would want to or need to invest a significant amount of time and effort into building a solution. Now they knew that they only had to find something on interim until the API would become available to them. The fast track architects in these cases and scenarios, they can also allow and get the customer onto the early adopters programs. So when there's something like that going on and the fast track architects have been made aware, they can go and get you early access to some of this functionality, even sometimes in production if there is a formal program of work that's been put out there. So that's why the relationship between the two is so key. And for a partner team, it's not to expect also too much, because at the same time as that situation, which shows a golden situation of where it has worked and the relationship has been successful in finding that gap in functionality that then was on the roadmap or could be put on the roadmap in other cases, the other end of the spectrum is that the partner team trying to say to Microsoft they need to design these solutions, or they need to provide more than just advisory, but POCs and proven worth that these solutions can work. That's ultimately the sign of a negative relationship, and sometimes that can come from the customer too. The circle that you're seeing here between the fast track architect, the partner team, and the customer team just ultimately is trying to show that they all should be actually one team. They should all be working together and not you trying to find and say, well, actually, I don't agree with this person, so I'm going to go ask that one. Or I think that you should have more responsibility for this program, Mr. Microsoft, when actually, ultimately, when it comes down to commercials, the agreement on the delivery, the scope, the requirements is always between the customer and partner. The responsibility is never on Microsoft to find a solution to that. If it's something that's been agreed to be delivered and then there's a stumbling block on the way, it's the responsibility of the partner and the customer to find that solution. It's not the responsibility of the fast track architect. They can route into the product group, they can try and find solutions, but it's not their responsibility to make sure there is one. When you have the customer success manager, because all of what we've just said is really technical, you'll see that actually I haven't really put a line between the fast track architects and the customer success manager. And that's because the roles are really quite different. With the fast track architects being very technical, process based, and alignment based with the product and the infrastructure, the customer success managers are always just about customer adoption. So you can get customer success managers for Dynamics 365, but also in Azure, in Microsoft 365. It's not something specific to Dynamics 365. And their key of what they're trying to achieve is ultimately making sure that the customer readiness is there, the structure is there, the adoption is there, and then the utilization happens and is growing after the customer goes live. So when you're going live, you might choose to go live with 20% of your user base as an early adopter, and then you want to ramp up from there. Your customer success manager is monitoring that usage from those customers from those users to say, oh, okay, how many licenses are allocated now, how many people are actively using the system. And if they see that they haven't got that growth, or the licenses aren't all being used, they'll start interrogating why, because they want to protect the investment the customer's making, because they know that they've purchased this much, and they're saying, well, actually, why aren't they using it? There's probably a problem here, and they want to come in and fix it. And the customer success managers are always there to support when something's starting to go a little bit quirky, something's not quite where everyone wants it to be. So their role is uniquely different to the fast track architect. And although they will be aware and be aligned with each other, the roles and responsibilities between those two teams are very different. And their ultimate access to the partner only really starts coming in if the partner is taking on some of the customer's native responsibilities, like are they doing the change management, for example. So then they'll start talking to partners. Predominantly their interest and their investment is in the customer team and making sure they're enabling and empowering the customer's team to do everything that needs to be done to be successful. So what is this documentation? What is the type of support Fast Track realistically give in this product scope? And because they've rechanged the baseline and they're being much more cautious about publicly outlining what would class you as that top tier customer, the mid tier customer, or the lower tier customer, which has the minimal support requirements. And to be honest, that's because they need to protect themselves from making sure they can focus on the key customers that they really need the help. And so for all of the customers, you're going to have, for top tier and mid tier, the initiate phase where you're going to the part. They might go to the partner kickoff. They'll do the initial onboarding, which is that lifecycle services onboarding, making sure that you've activated your licenses and you're all set up and ready to go. And they'll always, generally want to be in the customer kickoff meeting, just to be aware of what the project's about, getting a bit of an awareness of what's going on. Through your implementation, this is where it becomes a little bit different. So community office hours is more aligned to the tech talks, events like this, and just making sure that you're aware of all of the different ways and means you can go to find additional information about how to implement and what functionality could be available to you. The solution blueprint review is the top tier customer. So this is where the difference between those really complicated, large scale customers come in the mid tier, and why partners are now being required to do the solution blueprint review training. If you're that top tier customer, you will still get fast track architects in reviewing the solution blueprint review, providing advisory at that stage. If you are the mid tier, that is now the responsibility of the partner. And this is where there's a slight change, because of there only used to be those 2 tiers and now there's 3. The refinement reviews of the SPR, the top tier customer, they have access to have the fast track architect in all of the required ones, whereas if they're mid tier, it's only if they see a real problem. For example, it will be, oh, we don't think that you really thought too much about your data migration. You need a data migration strategy, you need to do this, you need to do that. that's when it's optional when it comes to mid-tier, based on whether the fast track architect believes it's something that is definitely mandated. And implementation monitoring is the touch points. So generally speaking, depending on the customer, the need, the time in the program, every 1 to 2 weeks, there will be a meeting where the customer, the partner, and the fast track architect are invited to, and I'd always encourage everyone to join. It's where you just talk about what's going on. Oh, we found this bug, and it's a bit of a blocker for us, but we're in the middle of delivery, so we don't mind yet. Well, the fast track architect will say, well, send me the link, because you might not mind now, but in 4 weeks you will if we haven't fixed it yet. And it's just touch points to say, okay, is the project still on progress? Is there anything that's going on, or any advice that could be taken or given? That's even just oh, have you seen this notification or this comms come out? It might be something of interest to you. And there should only even really be half an hour most of the time. And it depends what's going on in the project. Then when you get close to deployment, this is where the fast track architects really start coming into it. The pre-go live workshop is really critical, and the assessment even more so. Your go live checklist is where Microsoft can and occasionally have said, we're just not going to allow you to go live at this point because you haven't done relevant checks and testing to make sure your go live is successful. Because once you've gone live, it's incredibly difficult to go and fix something like if a data migration has gone wrong. And they have the ability, when they're doing the pre-go live assessment, to have a look at the different non-production environments you have and say, well, how many users have realistically been using and testing in the system? How many data migration runs and how much data have they put into the system? They can raise if your assumed transactional volumes seems much bigger in non-production than what you're stipulating in your go live checklist. So this isn't just about a conversation at this point. This is about you evidencing that you've done testing by the user base on the right custom code that you may be doing, on the ISVs, on your data, and making sure that you are really ready for what's going to happen next, because going live in IT transformation, as we all know, is really, really quite complicated and really quite complex. And if you are that top tier customer, or sometimes even mid tier, this is up to the discretion of the fast track architect at this point. They will do touch points through the cutover just to make sure everything's going okay, make sure there's no issues. If you have a support agreement, your support point of contact will usually be there, hovering just to keep an eye on things, same as if you have a customer success manager. Once you get there, you have your post-go live review to say, actually, was there any lessons learned? Did we have unexpected bumps in the road? Did we, after all of our data migration tests, we still have an issue? And trying to just understand where that came from to try and correct any future issues, because once you've gone live, Microsoft will walk away, as in a sense, but you will still want to evolve your application. You might want to go live with more modules or more legal entities. You don't want the same problem again. So this is about just education as to, okay, how can we do it better the next time? Because with most customers, there's going to be a next time. And even with just one version where you're having to take the monthly updates, you need to make sure that you're doing adequate checks even at those points to get your system stable and all of that functionality working as you need. When it comes to the solution blueprint refinement reviews, these can be really interesting. And the biggest thing I will say to any customer and partner is the program managers always forget about these. So if you're a project manager, if you're not even necessarily Microsoft focused, or if you have friends who are not Microsoft focused who you know are working on Microsoft programs, this is the biggest gap in where things already or in the relationship start going a little bit wrong. Because in most partners, they don't expect to have to spend the time and effort for both their teams to deliver these workshops and to walk through this information, especially with those most complex customers. They won't have in the project plan having to do the environment plan review, data migration review. And the fast track architect, when they're talking to you, they will say, okay, which of these do we believe is absolutely needed by the customer, which are irrelevant? Okay, you're not doing any reporting at the moment, that's phase 2, so we won't do a BI review. But some, if they go and do a data migration review, and they're talking to you and they say, well, okay, have you thought about all of these things? There will be then another subsequent review because you have to take away that information, think about it, and make a number of decisions. So these can become recurring meetings as well as just a one-off meeting to prove you've thought about it and you've got the document. If you went to a test strategy review and you already had a testing document that the customer and partner had agreed to, and to be honest, it covers everything, then that will just be a quick session, just doing a walkthrough, making sure everyone's on the same page, and then it's closed. But this information is vital. And I think for most people, when you look through this, you'll look and think, well, this is common, right? The data migration, environment planning, performance integrations. But more often than not, if you really think about your implementation approach, whether you're agile or waterfall, usually that's done sort of in the build phase. And the reason Microsoft tends to try and say, let's just front load this, because it's not about having every piece of detail in the solution design there. It's not about doing, or then forcing you onto this waterfall approach, which is very documentation heavy at the start. It's about saying, okay, for integrations, you've got 25 interfaces. We know at high level, it's going to be customer data, purchase orders, whatever it might be, worker data. That's fine. But for those, what's your integration strategy? Are you using the data migration framework? Are you using logic apps? How are you going to be transporting and securing that data? You'd need an integration strategy. So it's not about having a full technical design document and knowing every field for every interface you're going to need. It's about having the basics of, okay, how strategically are you going to do interfaces into finance and operations from the customer systems? That may be on-prem, that may be external. And have you thought about how you're going to secure them? And if you're going to have to worry about the load, if it's a once a day data dump, then you know that you're probably not going to have to worry about the load because that's out of business hours. If you've got a massive, heavy, recurring load that's going to be every 2 minutes, then this is where the strategy comes in of saying, okay, what sort of data, what's the load of the data, because this starts building out what that end system needs to look like. And also for the fast track architects, they can say, okay, right, we need to be careful because these entities can be quite heavy. We wouldn't necessarily recommend these. Okay, now try and use some custom ones, refine your fields down, do this, do that, so we can get the most out of the performance because that data is quite complicated. That's the sort of conversation they're wanting to have. And that's where this comes in. The reason that it's saying here iterative solution review is because they are allowing some of these conversations to filter on and evolve through the implementation process. They don't want necessarily for you to have all of this information early. And we've all been there on customer sites when it's not. But this is also where it becomes very early on strained if you've not front loaded enough time for these conversations. And when it comes to the mid-tier customers, you do have more flexibility, but you still have the responsibility to do it because you don't have the fast track architect necessarily assigned for doing all of the workshops and all the information, but you still have that expectation. And this is what they're saying. So people often say, oh, well, where is SureStep? Has it gone now? What's the best practice approach? Usually a customer, when they're getting a bit frustrated, the solution blueprint review is the new SureStep. It's where it's coming in. Microsoft aren't going to tell you now what that document needs to physically look like. I've seen multiple classifications of how it works. They're not going to tell you what documents you should necessarily physically deliver, And they're not going to say, oh, would the best practice be for waterfall? Would the best practice be for agile, or somewhere in between? And I think we all know agile is the most common way to do it. But the general concept is ultimately you need to be thinking about these things because they're where they're most commonly going wrong. The success of all of these, the responsibilities on the customer and the partner. Things like performance. It's very common that someone will say, okay, well, Microsoft are responsible for the infrastructure, it's not performant. Well, you should have done performance testing, you should have done performance planning, you should have done custom code re-engineering to make sure you're making it as advanced for suitable performance as possible. As a customer, you can choose to have a performance review done by Microsoft and the MCS team, but at no point is Microsoft actually responsible for the performance of the environment itself. And they won't, or are very unlikely to fix it by just adding some more processing power. Not unless you can actually prove that you've optimized everything as much as you physically can, and there's still an issue somewhere. So that's really what I wanted to focus on, because I don't know whether I'm talking to, and I've lost everyone completely. But it doesn't need to be as complicated as we very often find it. And it doesn't need to be as constrained as we very often find it. Once, especially for partners, you have these documents for delivery, you can standardize these that you can use across your customers. If you're selling, for example, a solution to customers, you can say, well, this is the implementation strategy that we follow. This includes how we will do your performance testing, how we will do your SIT testing. This includes how we advise you should do your user acceptance testing. You can then bring all of that information to these meetings. The most common thing is the overhead and the craziness that comes behind it, and it doesn't need to, because a repeatable delivery approach that falls in line with these documentations and these requirements from Fast Track, then the customer gets the same benefit of all of this information and a more structured approach to delivery that's repeatable, whether Microsoft is involved or not, and putting that responsibility back onto the partner. And when you build up that rapport with Fast Track, more often than not, you will then become the trusted partner that they will be a little bit more hands-off, purely because they know you've got it in the bag. So you can then build those relationships up, you can build that repeatable asset pool, and you can ultimately get it up and running. So on that note, and I think there's about 10 minutes to go, I think that was my last slide, yeah. So really I wanted to make sure, and I've left a little bit more than I thought I would, but I wanted to give an opportunity for some questions and answers, because I know it can be quite contentious about Fast Track and eligibility. So I didn't know if we had anything coming in.
Thank you, Kaila, for that. Great insight. I know there's so many questions about eligibility around Fast Track, and just looking at the question and answers in the comments in the comments section, there are a few questions that we have here. So let's take a look. So it's saying here, what Fast Track is adding a value to the implementation. So they're asking, what value are they adding to the implementation? That was a question just asked by Nazim. I know your whole session was on that, so maybe if you could just provide something a bit concise.
Yeah, to be honest, they're just trying to make sure you've thought of everything, and that's literally it. All customer projects are completely different, and all customers are completely different, and more often than not, partners don't necessarily at the moment use repeatable delivery methodologies either. So sometimes there'll be a project which something will just get pushed back. Security roles, for example, all the time, every project. Fast Track will bring that to the front. They will try and say, look, come on, let's do this. And What they're bringing to the table is trying to make you aware of something, whether that's in the delivery approach, the roadmap, or the design, that's going to trip you up in the future. And they're just trying to bring that forward to the table, so then actually it doesn't trip you up.
So there you go, Nazim. So it's the important that you get that Microsoft is available to be able to facilitate in the implementation. So there is definitely value in the insight with the engineering team, as Kaila mentioned, that provides that value that you wouldn't get otherwise. There's a question from Venkatesh asking, cloud-based load testing is end of life. Is there an alternative already in place?
So I'll have to find the link, and I will publish it. There is a new via DevOps and also the DMF integrations that they're bringing in. It was mid last year, I think it was, that they brought in some automated load testing tools which you could use. Primarily, you could use them for data migration or integration testing, where you can test the loading and also all the structure of your data migration end to end on the application itself. There is under heavy investment because that doesn't work for all applications. So for example, the HQ, finance, supply chain, that works. For the PSA, shall we say, part of project operations, it's not available yet. For the e-commerce tool, it's not available yet. But there are alternatives in the industry. But it's under heavy investment at the moment by Microsoft to provide those sort of tools. So I will find the one that they've brought out last year. They haven't heavily promoted it yet, but it's something that I've passed to some partners to try out and use. But yeah, it is also under heavy investment because I agree, it is a gap, and performance is one of the key hot topics all the time of these applications and the infrastructure.
I think one of the commonly asked questions around fast track is around eligibility. I don't know if you could spend a few moments just kind of reviewing the eligibility requirements for fast track.
Yeah, I mean, hang on, they have recently updated it, so let me just share my screen again, because this is what the new change was that we've had. So if we come here in Docs, which is always the easiest place to go, to be honest, this is where they've updated it. So historically, it was actually quite simple. If you brought enough licenses to mean per year you were over 100K, you would have access to fast track. It used to be that black and white, and there was a very, very small exception process. Now they ultimately realized there's so many people and so many projects ongoing at the moment. They need to try and get more customers on fast track whilst spreading the load across ultimately still the same number of people on the team. And that's why they've got this mid-tier that's come in. So you've got now this tier in the middle, and they're not putting any financial revenue against it officially anymore. They have said over, I think it's in here, you'll see it. No, it's over 100K. I think you absolutely have to have fast track nominations, but for customers that are over that, they will be likely aware anyway. When it comes to customers that are under that, it ultimately is going to come down to how strategic you are deemed to be for Microsoft. So when you're going into that mid-tier, the partner has to take a massive amount more responsibility to do the solution blueprint review, I will say it right one of these times, on Microsoft's behalf. But it still is required to then be reviewed by the fast track team, so they can still give you that feedback. Just the difference is the fast track team won't be in the workshops. They will just get the output of it. And that's their intent, to try and make sure more customers get access when it comes to it. In the slide deck, I've put the nominations link to nominate the customers. But ultimately, I would say at the moment, it's even more complicated now to understand whether you will be deemed eligible or not. And that's just because of them still trying to figure out the basis. Like this has changed slightly even since November last year, which is when I was first talking about it. I think we just need to see how the dust settles a little bit, but you can nominate every single customer. So if everyone who gets nominated, you'll then get information as to what, why, or how you can get access to. And the one benefit of it where it is today is that even if you are a smaller customer, but you can put a business justification to that customer, whether that's based on the industry or the complexity, you're more likely now than ever to get support from the fast track team. So there's a pro and con to that grey area, I suppose.
That's great. And while we've got you, Kaila, I mean, the customers. I mean, I'm sure there are many customers out there that are eligible but are not taking advantage. Is that the case?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. While I was working with Microsoft, even though I was allocated to a partner team, I used to work with the customer success unit for, to be honest, the biggest problem projects in the UK, because we all know there's some that hit bumps in the road. And in most cases, it was because of, it would have been much less of an issue if there hadn't been a relationship breakdown between Fast Track, the customer, and the partner for whatever reason. Because a lot of times what I've seen is Fast Track are either not informed because the customer and partner are saying, no, we're going to sort it out ourselves. Or Fast Track are only ever used as a bit of a stick to beat a partner up with because the customer doesn't like an answer they're getting. In all of those cases, the first thing I did when I went in to try and support is to make sure we rebuild that collaborative relationship and getting everyone in one room and saying, okay, here's the problem. How are we going to fix it? And in every single case, the project then managed to massively turn around and, in some cases, even turn around faster than we believed was possible to get the customer live with a system they were happy with. And it all just came down to how that interaction with Fast Track was and how much you were taking advantage of the access and support they can provide you as long as you're willing to collaborate with them.
Fantastic. So it was a great pleasure to have Kaila on board today to share that insight with everyone. So thank you so much, Kaila. I know you mentioned about the user group and everything else. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, obviously, before we wrap this session up?
No, I just watch this space. I'll circulate the slides to everyone. They're very available and happy to be shared because all this information is open. All I would just say is to everyone, even if you are not UK based, please fill in the questionnaire because these events are going to start off virtual, so they're available to everyone. And we are trying to find out what is going to be the easiest for everyone to digest and get the information we want. So the more responses we get, the better it's going to be ultimately for us and for you guys then to take advantage of what we're building out.
Fantastic. Thank you again so much, Kaila, for joining us today. So that was really good. So Kaila's going to be sharing some information in the chat window there. Now, as I've just